This is a short version of Thursday's class, since for some reason the record function turned off early after class started. So for those of you that couldn't make it to class or want to sort of read it or go back and see it again, here's a part of it, not all of it. So it's a short, streamlined version, I guess. One of the main things I was mentioning, I wanted to show you guys to visualize this whole issue of the plantation and the plantation sort of caste system that develops here in Hawaii, that Roar refers to, is this particular volume of pictures, which was taken by, as far as I can tell, a mainland school teacher. She came over here for a couple of years, I think. The album's dated from 1910. It ended up at the state archives. It's on the restricted list that you can't publish the pictures, so you guys can see them for this class, but they're not to be, put on websites for general access. So even though the state archives has most of their photo collection, which is huge, up and available for public access, it doesn't include this particular album. She was on Maui for most of the time, and she was teaching at a plantation school. As far as I can tell from the image, I'm not really sure. I've never been able to figure out where Kilapaki is. It was a camp or camp/village, but it's obviously on the edge of what was Wailuku. The Wailuku plantation mill, I think, was over here. So we're in basically central Maui on the north side. So this is some images that I want you to sort of take a look at, to sort of peruse as I'm going through them, to visualize the conditions. Remember, this is 1910. We're not talking, 1850s. We're not even talking mid-late 19th century. We're talking, 10 years after becoming part of the United States. So in that context, these are fascinating pictures. I'm just not being very happy with this. I think maybe what caused the problem last time. Let's see what happens if we try this. Okay, it doesn't transfer over. I've never tried to use Zoom with where you're latching on to different images like this. Okay, let's see if this one pops up, hopefully. We're going to have to do it this way. So here's an image of the village. This is actually Lahaina, one of the main streets in Lahaina, which was the big town at the time. So it gives you some idea of just the conditions, on the island in general, versus what we see now. So this is part of what the village looked like. So this is very explicitly, and obviously was one of the reasons she took the pictures, was because this was very explicitly a Hawaiian, or at least part Hawaiian village. So this is sort of unusual in that the Hawaiian population was not really involved very much in the plantation industry, and certainly not by the early 20th century. So I'm not really too sure what the relationship these people have with the land around them, or I should say with the plantation around them. Just as a note, what you're seeing here, they look like thatched huts, but they're not traditional Hawaiian huts. These are 19th, 20th century huts where basically you took the building materials that you'd used in the Hawaiian period, and you modified them to sort of emulate Western style houses. So this is sort of a Western style bungalow house, but done with thatch. This particular weaving pattern you see here on the side of the structure is probably representative of a particular population, maybe from this part of Maui. Different families in different places had different patterns of weaving the neo or coconut and or hala. This probably would be hala. So here you see what the place looks like. So it gives you some idea of the lifestyle, you might say, of the folks that are on the lower end of the social economic tier at the time. Now, this lady was teaching at the local school, and let's see, I'm going to find this here. Sorry, this is not turning on me as fast as I thought it would. Oops. This is probably why, I'm pretty sure this is why we lost the Zoom record function last time. So slower and you get to see it, it's probably a better idea. Okay. This is part of the kids at the school, and we're going to get into the Chinese next. So this is a good example of the Chinese as a population. What you've got here is a group of kids and their parents. pretty much their moms. The Chinese that arrive here in the 19th century, in fact, the Chinese right into the 1960s that arrive here, all come from a small, I should say, from a large town in Guangdong province. In fact, they come from a town that's about 40, 60 miles, about 60 miles outside of Hong Kong. It's called Zhongshan. So it's not the capital, which is Guangzhou. It's just a large town in China. Almost all the recruiting for labor forces here in Hawaii and for a lot of the U.S. mainland was done specifically in Zhongshan. So I can almost guarantee that the ladies here were all born in Zhongshan, not necessarily in the town, usually in a set of villages around them. There's about 45 villages around Zhongshan. My wife's family's from there. And what you find is that all these folks would have never met each other, but they're all from the same part of China. Now, as we assume when you get into Chinese, one of the key aspects of this is they're not actually Chinese, they're Cantonese. These are Hakka and Punti from this part of China. So they speak a different, very dialectically different version of something like Mandarin called Cantonese. They have a different set of values and attitudes. There's somewhat of an overlay, but they don't see themselves as Han Chinese, which are the majority, and the Han Chinese don't see them as Han. They see them as a minority group. Still today, in fact, there's big issues in China with this. The outfits the women are wearing are pretty much standard. The outfits that you see on some of the kids, especially the kid, let's see, there's a kid here with the striped pants. In fact, there's another one here. Most of especially the pants that kids wore, at least in this late period, up through the 19th century, would actually be specific to a particular village. So to a certain extent, what you have with some of the outfits, maybe this one too, is that the kids' outfits and parts actually reflect what village they're from. So identity was something that was very important to people, and you actually would have that, especially with children's outfits. Most of the rest of the kids are just wearing clothes. What you also get is part of the gap, because you have to remember, and here's, in fact, if you see back here, you see the school teachers. The lady would have been one of that group, I think. So what you get here is you have to remember that on one hand, you have the ladies here. They were born in China in what's now called, it used to be called Canton, now called Guangdong, in the area around Zhongshan. So they were born and raised speaking Cantonese, didn't learn any Mandarin, didn't know any other language. Suddenly find themselves in Hawaii with no idea what's going on, are pretty much sort of lost here. They marry Chinese who come over, maybe they're brought over as wives by the guys who are working on the plantation. The women would oftentimes either be maids or cooks or something, so they're all working. Now the kids that they're raising, the kids that you see here in the front, are going to a school taught by these Haole ladies here. In that school, they will not be speaking any Cantonese. They're not allowed to speak any other language. You're only allowed to speak English. So these kids by this young age are already growing up bilingual. They're hearing Cantonese at home and they're hearing English in the school. Their parents aren't hearing any English at all. They might hear a little bit if they're working, in the store or as a maid for someone, but even then it's just sort of more like a grunt and point. It's not really conversational English. So you're already seeing a major generational shift in terms of assimilation and adaptation to a place between the parents' generation, which is pretty much still in Guangdong, in Zhongshan, and the kids who are, of course, born here and already see themselves and identify with being here. They understand Cantonese, for example, but it's a good bet that when they're talking, they're probably speaking Pidgin, which is what the kids generally spoke. The teachers would be trying to teach them English. But when the kids are outside of class, they're interacting with other kids, and we'll see, in fact, let's see another picture here. I'll show you what this looks like. Okay, here's the ladies' school class. Notice the mix. Now remember, this is 1910. You've already got an incredibly diverse population in the schoolroom. You've got Japanese, probably looks like some Okinawan. I don't see Koreans there necessarily, but it's so hard to fathom out. There might be a couple of Chinese. You have one or two kids here. That might be one of the teacher's kids, but I suspect that one or two of these. This girl here is probably Portuguese Hawaiian. So what you've already got is a very, very complex, very diverse classroom. If you just look at these kids, it's no two or three of them look quite like each other. And this already makes it radically different than the mainland United States. And those little kids, we saw little Chinese kids in the last picture. This is the people they're going to class with. This is the people they're going to school with. They do not share a common base language. They're learning English in the school system, But you know, if this kid here is actually Portuguese, then they're speaking Portuguese. If she's Hawaiian Chinese, then that's what she's probably speaking, a combination of Hawaiian and Cantonese. If she's Japanese, then her at home, her family speaking Japanese. These kids don't share a common language base. To a certain extent, they do in English a little bit. But what they're going to be actually speaking is what everyone on the plantation figured out how to speak when they all sort of joined languages together. And that's what you call pidgin, or what's oftentimes called plantation creoles. So that's what these kids would speak. And they would get punished for it. You could not write, in fact, even today, you cannot write in pidgin at university or high school levels. You're supposed to do it in Queen's English or whatever the hell they call it in the United States. So these kids are actually speaking a different third language. It's not the language of their parents. It's not the language of the political school education system. It's a third language that allows them all to communicate effectively with each other. And this is also found in any other place you find plantations. If you go to Jamaica, their pidgin there is based on a different set of contributing forces. If you go to Louisiana, you get the pidgin there, which is one of the original terms of Creole. Comes from a complicated set of folks that end up working on the plantations and in the sugar fields in Louisiana. This is a different population here, so it's a different input, so the Creole sounds different. It's different words coming from different languages, but you build it into a brand new language, and then is reflective of the workforce in the plantation. This is what local kids spoke until basically it's sort of like the 1950s, is they spoke Creole, which here is called pidgin. It's not what you hear if you walk around today. What you hear, especially on Oahu, is just crappy English. It's not true pidgin. True pidgin is a separate language, and it dialectically varies from island to island in terms of which populations were there working on the plantation, but that's pretty much passed away. The only place I think you can still hear pidgin, though I know I still hear it, is if you're on the ranches. If you're like Ulapalakua Ranch or Halakala Ranch, the Paniolos, the cowboys, all speak pidgin, but they usually only speak it to each other, because even on East Maui, there's not a lot of folks that still speak pidgin unless it's the old folks. Most of the younger generation don't know what the hell they're talking. It's a different foreign language to them. So these kids keep this in mind. These are the kids. They all come from different backgrounds, but especially when these kids grow up and they marry each other, that becomes the diverse mixed population that becomes locals here. What they all share in common is they're going to public schools, and they're being taught by teachers who demand that they learn English as part of the social system, and they're interacting, and they all come from the plantation background. These are plantation schools, the public school. The public school system was originally largely funded by the plantations, and was a means by which the plantations both controlled their population, but also, provided some solace to their Calvinist attitudes about, you're supposed to help people become literate to gain salvation. So they saw that the workforce on the plantation, especially the kids of that workforce, were potential souls that could be saved. And so the plantations actually provide a fair amount of the funding for schools. During the monarchy period and the early territorial period, it generally wasn't, the government only provided partial funding. The rest of the funding was actually from the plantations themselves. In fact, if this will switch back. Okay, yeah, here we actually see, here's your kindergarten class. And the building would have been paid for by the plantation. The plantation would have put up the school. They'd probably pay part of the salary of the teachers, and then the territory, since it's 1910, would pay the rest of the salary of the teachers. But what you're not going to get in this school is any students that have any middle class or upper middle class students. They're not going to be going to this school. They're going to be going to, let's see if we can find this here. Oh, here we go. Okay. Here's your elites. This is your upper tier in local society through the late 19th and through large part of, in fact, basically almost all the 20th century. These are your plantation owners. So this is the group that I very specifically call the Kama'aina. Now, there's the thing about these guys, and this we'll just pick on. I have no idea who these people actually are. But this is on Kauai. Okay, that means we'll say this guy's one of that group. That means his last name is probably Wilcox in one way, shape, or form, because they're the family that pretty much owned Kauai. And we'll say that he owns hypothetically this particular plantation. He, on one hand, he's part Hawaiian. That's how one way they acquired part of the property. But he will have been sent to school on Oahu to go to Punahou, Oahu College. When he graduated from there, he would have been sent back east to New England to go to university there, and then he would have come back to Hawaii, and eventually back to the family's area on Kauai to run this. So on one hand, these folks are from Hawaii, and in fact, they predate the rest of the local population, with the exception of Hawaiians, because of course they're part Hawaiian. So they predate the Chinese and the Japanese, all those other groups we saw, the little kids in the school. Their parents didn't show up in Hawaii till the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. These folks, their family originally showed up in Hawaii in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. So in a weird way, these folks are actually more local, if you want to use just sort of the length of stay in a place, than the kids in the school. But notice how they've gone to great effort and great length to actually look like they're from the mainland and to dress like the mainland, and they're going to speak good English like you do on the mainland. They very much sort of see themselves as, on one hand, they're missionary boys. They do see themselves as born and raised in Hawaii, but they also identify themselves as basically being New Englanders, and very much in what you might call upper middle class New England society. And you know, if you took away the palm trees, you could take this picture and put it in New York or in Massachusetts or something at a party, and there would be no difference. Now, in that context, what you also have to remember is several things. One is, we'll say that these guys sort of look similar to each other. So we'll say hypothetically this is the dad and this is the son. That probably is a good guess. And so we'll say this is one of the Wilcoxes, and this is a kid. He's being groomed to take over the plantation. So his dad's going to be raising him with the idea that he's eventually going to take over the family business, which is the plantations on Kauai. He will have married this lady. I'm just making this all up. I have no idea who these people are. He will have married this lady, and she'll either be one of the other local families here, which was fairly common. So her family might be one of the Alexander or Baldwins, for example, who owned Maui pretty much. Or very typically, she'd actually be from an upper middle class New England family that he met when he was going to university at Harvard, Yale, or one of the Princeton, one of the other New England universities that your Kama'aina elites went to. Okay, so she's being brought into Kauai upper class Kama'aina society, and these people owned pretty much everything. If you think about it, they owned the schools, they owned the plantations. They pretty much paid for anything they wanted to, and if they didn't want to pay for it, it didn't get built, because they're the only big revenue stream in the late monarchy period and in the territorial period. Now in this concept, then we got the two girls. Now on Kauai, they would have been shipped to Oahu to go to Punahou. If this were Maui, which I'm more familiar with, these girls would be at Seabury, which still exists. That's the very elite private school on Maui for, I think, K through 12 or third grade through 12, that anybody still goes to on Maui. It's very limited enrollment. It's very expensive. If you're on the Big Island, it would be Hawaii Prep, Hawaii Preparatory Academy, which again was originally intended for the Kama'aina kids to go to school. They didn't go to school in the public schools with those kids we saw earlier. These girls would have some contact with those kids if they're hanging around outside, but the family would be very careful to very much limit the contact they have with the local kids. They would see each other in the distance, but their only contact that they're going to have with that local population is going to be the Japanese maid that takes care of them, or the gardener who's Chinese or something like that. In other words, the servant workforce on their house and around their house that's part of this elite establishment will be the locals, but they won't be interacting very much with the locals. And this becomes the sort of segregated society that you see in Hawaii right into the 1970s pretty much. Is on top you have this very powerful, very successful money and land dominant population, the Kama'aina. Underneath them you have sort of everyone else. At the bottom of that are sort of, almost off on the margins, you'd have what's left of the Maka'aina or Hawaiian population. Remember the lady in the thatched house at the first couple of slides I showed. So there's a very sort of odd relationship. The folks that weren't in charge, i.e. the workforce, were very aware of the fact that they weren't in charge. They weren't stupid. It's real obvious who was in charge. In fact, there's a great picture here. Let's see. Yeah, this is the one. About how all this all plays out. So here, let's see if we pop that in. Here we go. This is a fantastic image that gives you a sense of that relationship. Here's your Kama'aina elites. And here's Japanese women that some of these are kids, but a lot of these are probably also wives of Japanese that were brought over for the plantation. In many cases, these wives are brought over as what we call picture wives. We'll see later. So what you've got is them dressed. This might be during New Year's or some other, maybe the old ball, probably New Year's, I would think. And so what you've got is notice the relationship between the women and the Haole guys, these Kama'aina. it's no doubt who's in control knows the difference in dress, the intentional difference in dress, and the intentional difference in sort of messages of what you might call very much New England or American sophistication versus the exotic other. And this is really key because you have to remember this remains what you see in Hawaii. In some ways, it's very sad to say, for example, in the educational system, even down today in 2020, your private schools here are very much in the model of generating people that would fit into this type of society. If you go to Punahou, Iolani, or one of the other high-end private schools, their job is to make you fit very well into the 2020 version of the elites. If you're in the public schools, Kaimuki High, McKinley, Roosevelt High, you're like where this girl here would be. These two girls are going to public school, I can guarantee. Their interaction with the kids of these guys is going to be minimal at all, if at all. And so what you get is a very segregated society. It's not based on color. Because the interesting thing is, let me pull it out this next picture here. Oops, sorry about that. It's actually faster to do it that way, I think. It's sort of hard to see because the thumbprints are so small. Oh, that's not what I want. That's the one. Okay, let's share it here. It's important to remember that the force that actually is sort of the leavening force in all this, or the balancing force in all this, was the Hawaiian population. Here we see a luau. This is a very traditional luau in terms of the layout. So here you've got just a long thing, usually of coconut frond mat that's been woven just for this occasion. So you've got a bunch of people sitting here and they're all sharing food. Here's everyone's individual poi bowl, which is still the way you do it. But all the other food is just laid out and people just pick and choose. So it's like if you go to a Chinese, if you eat with Chinese, a Chinese banquet is the same thing. All the food's in the middle and people all share the food. And sharing is a big part of the social engagement of it. Luau's were intended to be places where people got together and enjoyed company. And the food was a complement to that, or encouraged that. So what you've got here is a largely Hawaiian, though I'm sure there's some other, maybe Chinese, Japanese, or whatever. But everyone at this luau would be invited, probably maybe as a church. I suspect it's probably a church luau. So what you've got is this is one of the main aspects of Hawaiian values that persisted and become sort of generic to the local population in the 19th and 20th century, is the idea of group. The idea of things like luau's. Luau's you see today, they use the same term, but it isn't really the same type of setup very much. But also just the idea of the food. If you go to Maui or something like that, you'll find that even the Chinese, Hawaiians, or other groups, when they're having a luau, poi is still center place of the meal. So what you find is a lot of the Hawaiian foods become consumed within the local population. Those local kids, that one picture with all the local school kids, they're all eating, in many cases, a lot of them are eating already, Hawaiian food in the sense of luau or lomi salmon or something like that. That's already become part of their diet. It wouldn't be their parents because it would not have that in China or whatever, but it's part of theirs. Now, the other part that's probably equally fascinating about this set of pictures, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't intentional, but I don't know this lady, so I'm not sure what she was trying to take a picture of, is if you notice at the end of this long thing, for some reason I can't, here I can, okay. Here's the lady setting up the luau, and here you see him laying out the luau. Yeah, this must be a church luau because it looks like a church. So what you've got is everyone's getting ready, but also everyone's helping out. So luau's are shared events. Everyone helps put it up. Everyone helps eats the food. Everyone socializes, and everyone goes home. The only folks that don't too much would be the older ladies, but they're probably the ones that cooked a lot of the food. So luau's are always cooperative group events. You would never think of, for example, catering a luau. That would be bizarre back in the time. So this is how the food's laid out. Everyone sits on the ground, and everyone consumes and has a good old time as a group, sharing. Now, if you notice who's at the end of the table is the teachers from the school. Now, where you're not going to find the teachers from the schools, you're not going to find the teachers of the school at, dang, where'd that picture go? Oh, here it is. All right, let's see if I can do this and flip back and forth on these. Okay, I can't. I have to do it this way. What you're not going to do is you're not going to find those ladies at this. Now we're back to our elites. In fact, I think this must be the same party that we saw that earlier picture. Here's your Kama'aina elites at their version of a luncheon or a party. Notice how it's sit-down chairs. It's very much, 1910 high-end outfits, especially the women's outfits are very, they're very expensive. Got to be uncomfortable as hell if this is in summer. So what you're looking at is people that are very concerned about what they look like. Notice how the socializing is very formalized. The people are sitting a particular distance apart. There's certainly no sharing of food or anything like that. People would be given individual plates. So this is, this is still sort of Euro-American society even today looks like this. If people go to a dinner at a restaurant in the United States, they expect a separate plate of food. I order my food, you order your food. And, and in fact, in upper middle class American society, even today, you never share food off a plate. It's considered very, very poor form. And that's something these folks grew up with. Now, mind you, remember, for the older guys sitting down here, if they're from, this is an image from Kauai. These two older guys here, if they're actually part of the Wilcox family, they're actually probably related to those Hawaiian ladies that are sitting down at that luau on the side of the church. That's probably, in some way or shape or form, that they're probably part of the same, at least same population from the same part of the island, though they would have been chiefs, they would have been Hawai'i, they're part of the family. So they're not entirely different. These aren't aliens in Hawaii. But notice how totally different their view of something like food and socializing is from the ladies' version. And notice how in the ladies' version, or I should say in this version here, and notice how in this version, the school teachers are actually in part of this group. To this population, these are the teachers that are teaching at their school. Their kids go to the public school, and these are the teachers of the public school. That's undoubtedly why they're there at the luau. They were invited because they're the teachers at the school. Their kids all know them. So to a certain extent, what you find is you can be Haole. And this is, in fact, these are folks here are good examples of that category I had when I was talking about the idea of the professionals being distinct from the Kama'aina. These folks aren't going to get invited to that Kama'aina fancy lunch that I just showed you. They're going to be eating with these people. Now, they're not going to be a part of this group in the sense that they don't really understand what necessarily is going on. It looks like they don't, I only see one poi bowl here, so they're probably not too into poi. But they're more a part of, they're more embraced and accepted within the local working plantation population than they are by the elites, though ironically, in many cases, they might even be educated at the same places the elites went to school at, though generally not. But they generally have at least a partial university education, usually at least 2 years. So these are well-educated people, and they're white. So if you use a lot of the mainland attitude about this stuff, which is it's color-based, then these people should not be sitting down at this table because they're sitting down with people who are not white. They should be in some way, shape, or form with the folks at that fancy lunch. But here in Hawaii, it wasn't color, it was based on your social networks and what part of the society you fit in. And the teachers in general found themselves whether they wanted to be or not. They found that this was the part of the society that they were being told you're going to fit in here. Now, this wasn't always something they were very comfortable with, because you have to remember, again, if these are classic sort of mainland Americans and these ladies are educated in sort of mainland American society in the late 19th, early 20th century, they would have had no experience with other folks. On the mainland United States, enormously strong color segregation rules were in place, and even ethnic rules. So for example, if she was German American in 1910, she wouldn't be sitting next to a guy who's Irish American in 1910. Those groups were not allowed to intermix directly in most cases. So you could even be white, but you could be from the wrong type of white. And if she's German American, she would not be allowed to sit next to some guy who's English American, in the sense of Anglican American. They would not be invited, or at lunch they wouldn't be seated next to each other. Because again, the German Americans were not considered at the same socioeconomic sophistication level as Anglo-Americans. Although by the early 20th century, it's starting to change. So, this is reflective of a very complex difference that in some cases they really liked. In other cases, they were very uncomfortable with because they were not used to dealing with folks who looked different, spoke different, came from different backgrounds. And in many cases, had a really hard time making that adjustment, which is why a lot of these teachers only stayed here for a couple of years. I don't know if that's why the lady's album ends, if she leaves Hawaii, or if, that's just the only album they still have left. I don't know. And to be honest, it's, it sort of is what it is. But for our purposes, what's really fascinating around here is you actually see in these images the social divisions that were already in Hawaiian or in local society by the early 20th century, that pretty much they don't exist the same way today, but they are the basis, they're the foundation, if you would, of the social dynamics you see in Hawaii in 2020, can be sort of seen in this set of images in this lady's album from 1910. Last part, just because I distinctly remember I included that in the, the image. Okay, use this one. As I mentioned in the regular talk yesterday, one of the huge things you have to remember about the plantations here are radically different than their counterparts anywhere else on the earth. If you go to Micronesia, the Germans had plantations, for example, with the Micronesians. The plantations the Germans had look exactly like the British plantations in Fiji, or the British plantations in Jamaica, or the British plantations in India, which looked exactly like the French plantations in Southeast Asia or somewhere else. So globally, the plantation system was pretty much cut and dried. And in many cases, it's been there for a really long time. Your British plantations and the Dutch and French ones in the Caribbean date from the early 1600s, from your old Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So the plantation system as an economic system had been around for hundreds of years. Hawaii is one of the last players in the game. Plantations don't start up in here in any way, shape, or form really till the 1930s, 1840s, 1850s. By then, plantations in a lot of the rest of the world have been in place for a couple hundred years at minimum. And the Calvinists are different because your plantation owners everywhere else, whether it be Germans in Micronesia or the British in Fiji or whatever, they're in it for the money. They're running a plantation system because they're going to grow something, they're going to make money off of what they grow, and they're going to sell it in a global economy and take that money. So as I pointed out, plantations were agribusiness. They were sort of like a factory, but the factory was of growing plants versus making cars or iPhones or something like that, but it was the same concept. So in that concept, what you had is no one was interested in the population on the plantation. The population on the plantation were one human-powered machines that you use to get the plants to the point where you could sell them. So you use the human-powered machinery to cut the sugar cane, turn the sugar cane into sugar, and you sell the sugar. And the people that make that happen are the equivalent to a 5-horsepower engine. In fact, if you think of the term horsepower, it means 1 horsepower. So to a certain extent, plantations were run off what you might call human power, 1H power in the sense of 1 human power were how the plantations functioned. So the plantations were based on this particular set of concepts. Let me go back, switch back this one image here. And so in that, you weren't concerned about the plantation population, except in its ability to either assist you or get in your way in terms of making your money, which was off of converting the plants. And here you see a classic example. Here's some of the Japanese ladies, probably the same Japanese ladies we saw in that earlier picture, in their better clothes with the Haole guys behind them. Here you see them in their clothes working the plantation, very heavy clothes to protect them from the very razor sharp sugar cane, the heat of the sun and everything like that. This is how the plantation owners saw them as human machinery. Their job was to cut the sugar cane down, move the sugar cane over to the mill, process it and bag it and turn it into sugar that's then going to be sold. On one hand, they're aware of them as human beings, but on the other hand, what's most important is the fact that they make money for the owner. Now this is nothing different. The whole discussion of factories in the 19th century by Marx and Engels is a good case of the same thing. So this isn't news. But the important thing about that is the Calvinists found themselves in sort of an odd situation because remember, unlike your money-making plantation owners who see just as an economic activity, the Calvinists are coming this, at least in one part. On one hand, they're into making money, they're Calvinists. But on the other hand, you have to remember they originally come from missionary backgrounds. And so unlike their counterparts in the rest of the world, when they see these ladies here, they actually also see women that if you teach them English and you teach them the Bible, or you also convert the Bible to Japanese as they did, and teach them the Bible in Japanese, you have a chance of saving these women's souls. So what that means is you're going to be much more in these women's face. You're going to be much more bothering them. You're going to be much more trying to get them to change behaviors or make behaviors that you feel will help them get to heaven, because that will make you feel good about yourself, because then you're doing what you're supposed to do, which is help others, which is part of the Christian ethic of the Congregationalist. So they weren't going to leave these women alone. If these women were in Jamaica or somewhere else in the world on their days off or time off, the plantation doesn't care what they do, just as long as they show up to work on Monday morning at 6 in the morning, then they don't care. Here in Hawaii, they were bothered by it. That's why the plantations built schools here. Plantations in the rest of the world didn't build schools. They didn't care what happened to the kids. They would just wait till the kid's old enough, then you bring the kid and the kid starts working in the plantation. Here in Hawaii, the idea of educating the children was really, really critical because they saw this idea of salvation and making kids better or making people better was a central part of the ethos that these people were operating under. And so what you do is, for example, you dress these kids up and you make them do stuff. Here's the teachers again. And you teach them how to be good, civilized members of modern Hawaiian American society as those folks in the really fancy outfits define it as. So you don't leave these kids around. You pay for a school. You probably provide enough of a dividend their parents can at least afford to buy them one nice outfit, which is probably not a nice outfit. Notice how no one has shoes, of course, in this period. So what you're doing is you're trying to assimilate these kids into a moral, religious world, not just into a sort of social dynamic of sort of, Hawaiian American society as seen by the elites, the Kamaina. So the owners here saw themselves operating with a different agenda than their counterparts in the rest of the plantation world globally. And with it, then, you get this weird dichotomy that sort of explains the plantations. It's a real good example of how perception drives reality also. The plantations, on the one hand, want to save people. On the other hand, their business is making money. And of course, the more money you make and the less that you spend, the more profit you make, so the better off you are. So in that context, what happens is the plantations are suddenly always caught betwixt and between. On one hand, they want to spend a little bit of money to provide the plantation school, but they want to spend as little as possible, so they're not going to pay for a good teacher. What they also did, and this is what drove everyone away from the plantations, is they had what they thought was very clever. And in hindsight, you look at it and you wonder what they were thinking, because on the one hand, they thought they were being really clever, but they are also very aware of what happened. So let's go through it very quickly. The plantations very early were trying to figure out how to maximize the amount of money they get from the workforce. Now, one thing is the Hawaii plantations paid really badly, even by plantation standards globally, which is why after 4 or 5 years, many of the places they recruited people wouldn't come here anymore because the conditions were so crappy and the pay was so low. But the main reason that they pissed everyone off is they got very clever, and I use that in a real bad way. What they decided to do is they're going to pay someone, we'll say, $2 a month, and that's what they get paid. What they decided to do very early on is they weren't going to pay you in cash, so they don't give you an envelope with money in it. What they do is they give you a chit, and so you go down there. They give just literally a piece of paper like an IOU, and you go down. We'll just pretend this is actually a housing barracks where people would have lived in. We'll say this is a plantation store. It's not, but it works. So what you do is you go down, and the only place you can spend that chit, it's like what we think of as a gift card today. If you got an Amazon gift card, or maybe better, like a Target gift card, you can only spend it at a Target store. And in most cases, I don't think you're allowed to convert those things to cash. You got to spend it on stuff in the store. So that's actually a modern version of what these guys were doing. The plantation owners made sure that their workers were paid in the equivalent of 19th century, 20th century gift cards. And you had to spend them at the plantation store. Now, what that meant is the plantation owner knew that everyone that worked here was going to have to buy everything from their store, which they also own. So what that means is they jack up the prices of like a bag of rice now becomes like 5 times what it's actually costing to buy it. So they just amp the prices up in these stores completely through the ceiling. And in doing so, their attitude is, well, what that means is all the folks that work over here, by the time at the end of the month they come over here to buy food to eat for next month, we'll make sure that we get most of what we paid them back because they'll have to spend it at the store. And they thought they were being so clever. And in hindsight, you just wonder, like, how could you do something so dumb? Because what happens is you have to remember that the folks working on the plantation weren't on the plantation because they wanted to be there. They weren't in there because, it helped build their body and, they liked sun and they wanted outdoor exercise. The only reason they were in Hawaii at all was due to the fact that the family was in dire straits back wherever they were from, whether it be Guangdong, China, whether it be Hiroshima in Japan, wherever. The family was desperate, and in their desperation, they told family members, okay, we want you to go work in Hawaii, but the only reason you're going to Hawaii is to send money back home so the family will survive wherever home is. So that was the context the workforce ends up here. The workforce is never here because they want to move to Hawaii. The workforce is here because the family has literally sent them to Hawaii as a way to save the family who is literally, in some cases, literally at starvation back where the family lives. So the folks working over here, those Japanese ladies that we saw in the sugar fields, their only reason for being here is to send money back to Japan. And the only way they're going to do that is through the paycheck they get. Now, if they're working here and they're living here, and at the end of the month they go and they spend what little they have, for example, for the food they need to eat, just basic things like rice, for example, and there's nothing left over, then they've got no money to send home. And at that point, they've just worked for an entire month, busted their ass 6 days a week from sunrise to sunset with maybe a 30-minute lunch if they're lucky. And in that context, they've got nothing to show for that time except enough food to survive next month. In fact, in many ways, the plantations were so bad at this that by the time you worked on the plantation for 4 or 5 years, you would actually owe the store money. They made sure that the prices that you paid for stuff were actually higher than what you made as wages. So you end up with a net deficit every month. And that to the plantations, they thought they were being so clever. Oh, these guys are going to be stuck here. They're going to work for us forever for free, basically. And the plantation workers are sort of like, well, this totally sucks. And I'm not going to put up with this crap. And so what they do is they just literally would walk. They'd break their contracts and they would leave. And they'd go to some place, generally in the rural areas where you'd find, for example, if you're Chinese, you go into rural areas where you find, especially Mao'akainana Hawaiians, with pieces of land that they're not working because there's just not enough family members left. They're just not that interested. They don't need that to survive. It's just extra land. And they go up to these guys and they basically tell them, can I do a deal with you? I'll work, these 2 acres outside of your house. I'll cut it 50-50, but whatever I grow here, I'll pay you 50% of that of what I sell the food for, and I get to keep the other 50%. And for your Mao'akainana, this was fantastic because now they've got someone to work empty fields. If they're working the fields, it means they can pay the taxes on the land. It also means no one will steal the land. So for the Mao'akainana, it was a perfect situation. For the Chinese and also the Japanese that follow them, it's a perfect situation because now they're in a place where they make more money. Now they can send money back home for 2 reasons. One is because they're making a little more. And secondly, they don't have to buy stuff from the plantation store. They can buy it from anywhere. So now all of a sudden the food's a hell of a lot cheaper. So that $1 or $2 goes a lot further. So now they can actually do what they promised their families. They can actually send money back home and help the family out. Now the plantation, you'd think normally, in fact, the plantations could send police around to actually arrest these folks as contract breakers and bring them back and change the plantation, beat them, and put them in solitary confinement and then throw them back out in the fields. Because just as a note for those of you involved in CJ and such, is that the plantations were the police forces in the islands. The government, both the Hawaiian government and then the territorial government only had sheriffs, so it'd be generally one per island. So the policemen that you would see on a particular island would actually be security guards hired by plantations, and they would police not just the plantation, but the whole island. So it was pretty much the Wild West. They could pretty much do whatever they wanted to, regardless of what theoretically the laws were. And that was another separation between your elites and everyone else. But why they don't stick the plantation police on these guys that have jumped ship, we'll say the Chinese, since that's the first group. The Chinese have left, they quit their contract. They're now in Kula or some other part of Maui or some other island, growing stuff on fields and then, then coming down to town to sell it. So he comes down to town. Now, we'll see this guy's growing rice somewhere. So he comes back here to the plantation store and says, hey, would you guys be interested in buying, like, say, 10 bags of rice? Now, the plantation store will know perfectly well who he is. So they could arrest his ass and they could put him back in here in the fields and try to get him to work. He's not going to be a happy camper. He's going to try to get other people to leave. So putting him back in the fields is not a particularly good idea from a practical standpoint. It makes more sense to do what they decide to do then. Is they go and they say, yeah, okay, we'll buy your rice. But they don't pay him as much as he could sell it, say, in a regular store. But they still pay him, not bad money. So he gets in the system of work he's doing. He's actually out somewhere. He's growing food crops, which then takes down to the plantation store and sells to the plantation, who then turns around and sells this to the new folks that have replaced him who work on the plantation. And they're not stupid either. They very quickly realize, they see him coming down here and they think, oh, he looks like he used to work here. In fact, hey, I know him. And they realize that he's been able to get off the plantation. He's in a situation where he can make money, send money back home, have a better lifestyle. He's actually working his own land or working land out on his own time versus working for the plantations in, sort of indentured servitude conditions. They decide, oh, hell with that, I'll do the same thing. So what happens is the plantations had a problem that a lot of their workforce would leave within 3 or 4 years. They'd get on the plantation, figure out how things are working, figure out enough pigeon to get by so they could talk to people, see how everything worked out. And they take one look at their lifestyle and say, oh, this totally sucks. This is ridiculous. And they would just leave and they'd go out in the countryside. Ironically, that means the plantation then has to bring in a whole new set of workers to replace the guys that basically jumped ship. In that context, then the guys that are now out in the countryside then sells products back to the plantation store, the plantation, which then resells it to the workers, and the new workers that replace the guys that are now outside. This was the plantation dynamic. Huge mass majority of the plantation workers never finished their contracts here in Hawaii. Now, a lot of them don't leave the islands. And in most cases, they're still on the same island, just not working for the plantation anymore. And the plantations are sort of okay with that because they're still making money off of this new workforce because they're getting to buy stuff cheaper. It's a hell of a lot cheaper to buy bags of rice from some guy on Maui than it is to ship in that rice from the mainland United States and then sell it at that same store. So the plantation can make more money off of the rice they sell grown locally than the rice they sell grown on the mainland to the new plantation workers. And they sort of figure, well, the money we're making off of this is worth the fact these guys are going to split after 3 or 5 years and go somewhere else. So the weird thing about the plantation system is it's largely responsible for the huge influx of population here in Hawaii. But it's important to remember that roughly 30 to 40% of the plantation workers never leave the Hawaiian Islands. About 20 or 30% go back to their home country. Another 20 or 30% usually go on to the mainland United States, especially the West Coast. But around 30 to 40% actually stay here. But they don't stay on the plantations. They're off the plantations as fast as their feet can move. They know they find a place to go to. And that the plantations actually decide over the long term that's not necessarily a bad thing because they've just found another way to make money. So the plantation system is really weird because it is the single engine responsible for two things. One is the growth of the largely Asian but really complex population that we call locals, which is what we're looking at for a lot of the rest of the semester. And secondly, it was the economic engine that drove everything here. Directly or indirectly, you either worked for the plantations, you sold stuff to the plantation, you bought stuff from the plantation or something like that. Somewhere along the line, the plantations were basically the engine, the economic engine that runs Hawaii right into the World War II period, pretty much. So this lady's images are fantastic because in many ways they actually give you visuals for the type of stuff that are covered in the PowerPoints. So, okay, that's that for this session.